Welcome back to the Panduit Digital Forum here live from London. Hope you all enjoyed the coffee break and the brief intermission. We've got 15 minutes or so now. We teased this in the panel discussion earlier this morning for those of you that joined us to delve into what the data center of the future may look like. So earlier on in the earlier data center segment of today's agenda, we talked a little bit about those evolving customer demands and the increasing capacity that we're seeing. Now we're going to turn the dial a little bit, ask David here to get his crystal ball out and look 10 to 15 years in the future.
Missing the crystal ball.
David, for those who weren't necessarily listening to our panel discussion earlier, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So my name's David Hall. I'm a senior fellow with Equinix, and I really focus on all things data center technology related. So any kind of physical infrastructure that goes in our data centers, and then all the way through to the physical infrastructure that keeps them cool and keeps them powered. And I kind of operate with my colleagues a lab in North America, our data center innovation lab, where we test some of these technologies. So I'm kind of looking forward to talking to you a bit about some of the things we've been up to and where we think the industry is heading in the kind of 5-10 year horizon.
And earlier on during the panel discussion, we had a lot of questions coming in around energy efficiency, sustainability, the importance of those anchors now for co-location businesses. And we teased a little discussion around cooling technologies and how that may support this drive towards more environmentally friendly options. Can you speak a little bit to the current levels of tech maturity, how they are supporting those initiatives, and actually what you see 10, 15 years down the line?
Sure. So we I love this topic because my first ever job in data centers kind of 20 years ago was actually under the raised floor ripping out liquid cooling, in a data center that had been designed for mainframes, and they were all going to be liquid cooled, and then still these pesky air cooled x86 servers came along, and then no one wanted liquid cooling. But I think a number of things have changed since then, right? So the first is this kind of I call it a kind of Dorito effect, right? So you kind of the limits of chip manufacturers have kind of passed this 165 kind of watt per chip, and that's like a magical number where air cooling works really efficiently. But as soon as you kind of pass that limit, then you kind of say, well, actually, do I need to look at something other than air? And I think we're seeing, particularly with GPUs, but also with the next generation of CPUs from the major manufacturers, that those limits are kind of really starting to be exceeded. So the kind of driver in all of this is actually physically people are making infrastructure that it's difficult to cool with air. It's difficult to cool efficiently with air. And so once you kind of get to the point where you kind of say, okay, well, is this a long-term trend? Yes. We look at these kind of technology architectures from the major CPU vendors. It seems like that's kind of sustainable, that trend. So we as a data center operator are going to have to deal with this. So how do we deal with it? Well, good news is liquid cooling is something that's kind of been around for at least 20 years. So what kind of liquid cooling? So I guess we sort of divide the world up into the most simple to deploy in a kind of traditional data center environment, and those are the kind of direct chip systems. So essentially you're removing the heat sink and the fan, and you're putting a new heat sink where you're going to pass some liquid and you're going to use that to remove the heat. And then the other kind of big alternative is immersion-based cooling. And I guess where Equinix sit, for a variety of quite complex reasons to do with the weight of these things and the kind of technological maturity, as you described it, is really these direct-to-chip systems. So really kind of minimal changes in terms of the IT infrastructure, but removing those traditional air-cooled heat sinks and replacing them with liquid-cooled heat sinks. So that's kind of where we are. We have a couple of systems that we've deployed in testing. So we have a two-phase direct-to-chip system, which is using a fluid that evaporates, and we're containing that evaporated fluid. It's a super efficient way of cooling it, but it does require the use of expensive engineered fluids. We're also testing water-based systems, and they come with their own challenges too, because it's water and it's a data center. But certainly, we have a kind of good degree of confidence, I think, that those systems are going to be a good solution to these very, very dense technical environments. And actually, it's kind of, what do we mean by dense? Well, we mean by dense kind of 40, 50 kilowatts plus per cabinet. So a real significant shift from, maybe a global average of less than 10 kilowatts per cab to kind of significantly higher. So something
not that long ago either.
No, not that long ago. I mean, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, really, and I still don't think I necessarily know the answer to this. Do people kind of limit their cabinets to 10 kilowatts because that's what they can get from their data center operator, or do people build data centers designed for 10 kilowatts per cabinet because that's all you can put in it in terms of the IT? And I think probably both of those things are true to some extent, but certainly now we're seeing real kind of production systems, and particularly driven by machine learning, where people are deploying GPUs at scale, but really 40, 50 kilowatts is a kind of conservative estimate, and I've seen kind of credible estimates of 100 kilowatts plus. So those are the kind of numbers that we're thinking about and really kind of working out how do we build the architectures to support that level of cooling.
And you talked about the economics of direct chip making sense in legacy environments or brownfield sites. If you were doing a greenfield project, would that still be your go-to if you're working at a higher density? Does immersion then have a role there? How does it?
So immersion is attractive because I can capture all the heat, right? So in a direct chip solution, I'm probably going to capture something like 70-80% of the heat. Because most of the heat's going to come from my CPU, my GPU, maybe my kind of, if I've got some XPGAs or something, and I can build solutions to capture the heat from those. But I've got other components producing heat, like the North Bridge, the South Bridge, storage and stuff, which is harder to capture in a direct chip system than it is with immersion. I think the challenge with immersion is that by the time you kind of physically weigh the things, they're heavy, they're big tanks full of liquid, and actually in a brownfield site, in order for them not to fall through the floor, I'm going to need to space them out. By the time I space them out, I've reduced my density again. And then there's all the complexity around how I operate them and manage them, and how do I train engineers to lift servers in and out of them. So I think that direct chip is a good kind of balance, because it kind of accepts that it's imperfect in terms of the heat capture, but it's relatively easy to deploy in a brownfield site. And then I think specifically from an Equinix perspective, we're not deploying huge supercomputers where it's all kind of very homogeneous, every rack looks the same. We have customers who only have network, right? And there is no liquid cooled network. You can't dip your favorite Cisco chassis into an immersion tank, it won't work. So we're always, I think certainly in the kind of 15-20 year horizon, going to have some air-cooled kit. So as soon as you say, well, I'm going to have some air-cooled kit in my data center, then it starts to kind of push you in the direction of direct-to-chip. So I think that's where we landed. I think there is a home for full immersion systems. I think you see maybe some of the hyperscalers investing in that because they have complete control of the stack. Certainly things like kind of supercomputers, again, where you've got these very homogeneous environments. Every rack is the same. That potentially an opportunity for immersion-based systems. But my view at the moment certainly is that direct-to-chip is probably slightly ahead, and certainly from an Equinix perspective, it's going to make more sense where we have 200 plus facilities. We can deploy that in many of those sites.
Makes sense. We had a lot of questions earlier on with regards to dirty diesel as well, and actually we've been getting a lot of OPs on datacenterdynamics.com with regards to the death of diesel in the data center. How do you see that one? You talked a little bit about fuel cells earlier. I know Equinix has been sort of leading the way on some of this work. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. So I think the first thing to say is that diesels do a great job, right? So the reason that we get 6 nines plus of availability across the estate is that we understand diesels, they work. If there's a significant kind of long duration outage in our HV power, we can truck diesel to the site, and we can kind of, we can essentially support the site indefinitely from diesel generators. But equally, it's true to say that, the majority of our carbon emissions as a business now come from testing our diesel generators. So our ambition to be completely carbon neutral isn't compatible with continuing to deploy diesel generators. So I think the first thing to say is, while we have all this infrastructure, the first thing for us to do is to see, is there an opportunity to operate that infrastructure using better fuels? And actually it's clear that through kind of investment in things like HVOs or diesel alternative fuels, that we can use sustainable alternatives to diesel to support our infrastructure that already exists, right? So that's kind of a good solution for the brownfield sites. I think HVOs are probably the solution now. I think things like blue diesel will become solutions in a kind of 5 to 10 year horizon. So that's great because that infrastructure exists. It's the most sustainable way of using your infrastructure is not to rip out and replace it. It's to greenify, I guess, the infrastructure you already have. Longer term, thinking about the kind of sites that we haven't built, it's a great question. Do we invest in large-scale battery? We discussed this with some of the hyperscalers. You can kind of convince yourself that you can deliver 4, maybe 8 hours of autonomy using batteries and using lithium, but that's obviously not going to sustain you through a serious outage in your HV. Something like a natural disaster or something where 48 hours of stored diesel is kind of significantly greater in terms of the capacity than 4 hours of battery. So I think that somewhere the gap between that 4 hours and that 48 hours is the challenging one. I think that some of the solutions that we're looking at, for example, are where we've deployed large-scale fuel cells. Some of those fuel cell systems can support things like liquefied petroleum gas. So you can imagine in some future scenario where you've got fuel cell that's capable of consuming green hydrogen, and also something like an LPG that primarily you'd power your site with green hydrogen, but then if there's some significant outage, you've got some stored LPG on site and you just essentially replacing diesel with liquefied petroleum gas. It's not green, but you're only going to be using it for very small durations during those kind of outages. So I think that's a very sustainable solution. Hydrogen is interesting, obviously, but storing hydrogen is hard. Storing hydrogen in kind of significant volumes requires cooling it and compressing it, all of which takes up a bunch of energy. I think that one of the areas that we're super interested in is how you can go about storing large quantities of hydrogen, because that seems like the perfect solution, but it's not obvious that kind of ecosystem exists at the moment. But certainly we're working on supporting and developing that ecosystem, and I'm convinced that in the kind of 10, 15 year plus horizon, stored hydrogen will be part of the kind of backup power component of most data centers.
And there's maybe a bit of an education piece there as well with the sort of legacy hydrogen perceptions given the...
Yeah, well, most of the hydrogen you buy at the moment is going to come from steam reformation of natural gas, right? So essentially you're kind of changing natural gas into hydrogen, but it's not green. I think as you develop better electrolyzers and there's more of a sophisticated distribution for green hydrogen, and more renewable essentially generation that's going to power your production of green hydrogen, for sure that's a great opportunity to use these assets that exist, which is your gas grid. You can already see kind of movement both in the UK and in Europe towards blended hydrogen natural gas grids. Certainly you can imagine that in a kind of 15, 20 year horizon you phase out natural gas entirely, but all this great infrastructure that exists to securely pipe the gas around can just be repurposed for hydrogen, and that seems like a fantastic opportunity for data centers.
We're running out of time on this whistle-stop technology tour, but it would be remiss of me not to end by looking at machine learning, automation, a bit of a future gazing from you on that. There's been a lot of talk around technology, singularity, etc. How do you see that one?
Definitely machine learning. Operating your data centers is complex. There's lots of kind of controls that you can vary. There's lots of systems that you can constrain set points for, and the impact of some of that stuff is complicated, right? So using machine learning to essentially infer what some change to your critical infrastructure will do in terms of your efficiency is a great solution. And actually, we and others and Google and everyone have demonstrated that this works. For example, we will look at in real time temperature, air, and we'll look at the pressure of the air that we're kind of delivering into the data center, and we can dynamically kind of make changes to that kind of operational environment using machine learning to predict the impact on efficiency. So everyone should be doing that. Those tools are available. It's well understood. I think Google were talking about it at least 20 years ago. So there's really no excuse for anyone not to be kind of evaluating that. And certainly we've seen at Equinix that's a great opportunity to improve our efficiency. And we're also now looking at how we use machine learning for other elements of our data center operations. So another great one is security. So, why do we have security guards looking at cameras when we could have machines, we're taking real-time video feeds and, helping us understand the kind of security and threat model of our data centers. So I think that's another big one for us is, using machine learning to provide kind of additional kind of physical security is a kind of great opportunity as well.
David, thanks very much. Whistle stop tour, future
stop
cooling,
tour.
power, AI. There's another great session coming up, bit of a change of pace. We've talked about hybrid IT. We're going to go on and look at a transition towards a hybrid workplace. Join that session coming up to you next from us here at the CBC in London. David, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
And enjoy the rest of the Panduit Digital Forum. Thank you and goodbye.